include the reduction in the amount of duty you pay on draft beers in pubs, though that only accounts for about 0.5% of that £94 billion.
I suppose whether it's a cut in your council tax bill or cheaper beer, it all helps in the short term, but it's not support for energy bills.
Exactly. Harriet Baldwin's leaflet said it was financial support to help people with their energy bills. And I suppose you could claim that if draft beer is cheaper, then pubgoers will have more left over to pay the gas bills. But clearly, many people will misunderstand the claim, as our listener Kristen did, because it is just begging to be misunderstood.
But what does Harriet Baldwin say about this?
I asked her. She said that the vast majority of the £94 billion was paid out over the winter of 2022-2023, when the government's two biggest energy support schemes were at their height.
Is that true?
No. Of the total £94 billion, 40% will be paid out in the current financial year, so not last winter. If we do look at the winter of 2022-2023, roughly £33 billion was paid out as direct energy bill support. Harriet Baldwin also told us,
I fear that the word constraints of an MP's leaflet do not allow the degree of detailed clarification that your excellent programme has been able to do.
Very flattering, but what she told her constituents wasn't just unclear, it wasn't accurate. She could have just said, over the past 2 years, the government has spent £94 billion on tax cuts, adjusting benefits in line with inflation, energy subsidies, and other financial support. Similar word count has the benefit of being true. Thank you, Nathan. Time now for something to warm the cockles of your heart. An old story of boy meets systematic audit. It's a tale of the power of data transparency and even of politicians doing their jobs. We love to see it. You might well have heard of Ben Goldacre, writer of the long-running Bad Science column in The Guardian, which skewered terrible science journalism, pseudo-scientific claims about alternative therapies, and also incompetent or unethical behaviour within the scientific establishment. He followed it up with the best-selling book Bad Science. Ben is now Professor Goldacre and heads the Bennett Institute for Applied Data Science at Oxford University, where he and his merry band of magnificent birds do all sorts of cutting-edge stuff to improve the way health data are used. And you should then listen to our Saturday podcast from last week. You can find it on Sounds by typing more or less behind the stats. But let's roll the podcast. Ben Goldacre has long been concerned, and even outraged, about the failure of medical researchers in pharmaceutical companies and universities to publish the results of all their clinical trials. I'll let Ben explain why this matters.
There's this sort of terrible problem at the core of evidence-based medicine, which it was considered quite transgressive and shameful to even talk about until recently, which is that overall about half of all the clinical trials that have been conducted and completed, when you go and look for the results, you find that they've not been reported, or not been reported in full or correctly. Now, that's a real problem. First of all, it's tremendously inefficient. Clinical trials often cost millions of pounds to run. But there's a second problem, which is we know that trials with less flattering results, or less statistically significant results, are more likely to go missing in action than trials with positive results. And so as a consequence, we know that the half of the results that we're seeing is a biased half. Now that's a real problem, because doctors, patients and commissioners of health services cannot make informed choices about which treatments work best unless they have access to all of the results of all of the clinical trials that have been done on those questions.
In a nutshell, if I tell you that I've been tossing this coin and I've got 8 heads and no tails, you'd think, okay, it's a biased coin, but actually if I tossed it 20 times and just didn't tell you about the 12 tails, I've told you nothing really, except lies.
That's exactly correct.
Remember, this isn't actually coins being tossed, but potential treatments for cancer or depression being tested. If the disappointing results disappear, and only the positive ones are reported, then doctors and their patients are being presented with a grossly misleading picture of the evidence. Ben Goldacre has been making a fuss about this for years. and in 2013 was one of the founders of a campaign to get all clinical trials registered before they started and published after they finished. The All Trials campaign. Things started to change, but were they changing fast enough? So with a team at Oxford University, he decided to set up a system to audit whether the results of medical trials were being published and then make that information public. Researchers had done these audits in the past by painstakingly going through all the registers and cross-checking publication data. But as soon as one of those artisanal, handcrafted audits was finished, it would be out of date. Could Ben's team do better?
Now, obviously, I couldn't afford a giant army of PhD students all locked in cupboards in a kind of hideous database searching sweatshop to do that work by hand. But luckily, computers had been invented, and so instead, we wrote a series of computer programs. A series of computer programs that go off and do this work for you.
Their data for universities and companies in the EU, which then included the UK, were put online at eu.trialstracker.net. Everyone could see which institutions were fulfilling their obligations and publishing every clinical trial. But the real breakthrough came in 2019.
The Parliamentary Science and Technology Select Committee came along. They looked at our data and they pulled out the records for British medical research universities. And they sent these out to the Dean of every medical school, and they said, just to let you know, in 6 months' time we're going to come back to this topic, and we will be inviting the biggest improvers and the people who are most far behind on their regulatory and ethical obligations to come and give us live oral evidence to talk about their performance. Now, in some respects, that was a bit unhelpful for me, because at the time I didn't have a permanent post, and that sort of thing does slightly annoy deans in medical schools and makes people a bit cross and sad. But what happened next was, I think, truly extraordinary and has not really been sufficiently celebrated.
I think at this point we should warn listeners that they are about to hear good news. And more than that, good news about the UK.
Across the whole of Europe, trial reporting performance has gradually crept up from being 50 to 60 to high 60% of compliance with regulatory and ethical obligations. In the UK, it's well over 90%. And that is an extraordinary thing, I think.
Professor Ben Goldacre. We couldn't fit all of his righteous data wizardry onto one programme, so if you want to hear more, please subscribe to More or Less Behind the Stats on BBC Sounds, where there was further statistical sorcery last Saturday. We've already had one Brexit economics flashback on More or Less this series. It's time for another. Listener Paul Parrott got in touch to ask about a claim Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg has been making about the money the UK has saved by not being part of the EU, and so, as a result, avoiding the cost of their COVID recovery scheme. Here is the Conservative MP on GB News.
There's £191 billion that we have saved by not being part of the EU's COVID recovery scheme, a liability that the British taxpayer would have taken on.
£191 billion sounds like a lot of money. Are his calculations correct? We asked Professor Ian Begg from the European Institute at LSE to explain where this number comes from.
My understanding is that he's referring to the claims being put out by the European Commission to have this huge package of support for recovery from the pandemic. However, I do know that the package of measures from the European Commission comprises two things. One is the standard EU budget, which was negotiated in 2020 for the following 7 years. And the second is the distinct recovery package, usually known as Next Generation EU.
So there are these two separate things. One is this COVID recovery package thing, and then I think I heard you say it's the entire budget of the EU.
Yes.
Jacob Rees-Mogg sent us a brief explanation of how he reached the figure of £191 billion, and it's along these lines. first, take the entire EU budget from 2021 to 2027, which is about €1 trillion in 2018 money, and then add on the one-off borrowing the EU took out for a massive COVID stimulus package. That's another €750 billion. Add it all up and divide it all by the rough proportion of the EU budget that the UK used to pay for, that's 12%, and that gives you £191 billion. Wait a minute. The entire EU budget over 7 years from 2021 to 2027, it seems that both Jacob Rees-Mogg and EU politicians are happy to suggest that this is something to do with recovery from the pandemic. But is it accurate to describe 7 years of absolutely standard budget spending as part of a COVID recovery scheme?
It's worth looking at the composition of the 7-year programme that the EU agreed in 2020, which covers the period 2021 to 2027. Roughly 60% of that is going to go on a combination of direct support for farmers and support for regional development in the EU. A further 9 or 10% will go on the Horizon Research Programme. Then you have the EU's interventions in the rest of the world, which it calls external policy. And you soon get up to the 100% of that EU budget being devoted to things that the EU has long since been doing. Therefore, in no real sense is it a recovery budget, because it's what they would be doing anyway.
So he is causing confusion by mixing these two things together, but he's not the only one who's causing this confusion, because the European Commission is doing pretty much the same thing.
Yes, I think there's obviously a tendency in Brussels to say, look how much we're doing to help you. But their conflation has become the conflation that Jacob Rees-Mogg is using, which leads to the figure which is inaccurate in my judgment.
If this argument is right, and the entire EU budget over 7 years should not be described as a COVID recovery scheme, then you can cut that original £191 billion by more than half. But is there a better number? After all, there is still a huge amount of money, €750 billion across the EU, that was specifically raised to pay for a big pandemic stimulus plan. Not that EU members actually have to spend it on anything particularly COVID-y. More than half is being spent on projects that fight climate change and make the EU economy more online and digital. This €750 billion stimulus itself has two parts, a loan and a grant.
Up to €360 billion could be borrowed by member states should they want it. Some like the Dutch say we can't be bothered. And 390 billion is in grants.
So EU member states decide if they want to partake in the loan part. If they do, they'll have to pay it themselves. So it's not really a financial burden on the EU. The grant part will eventually come out of the EU budget. And the grant component is, as Ian Begg told us, €390 billion. So a more accurate number for what the UK might be contributing towards this recovery fund if the UK were still in the EU is nowhere near £191 billion. It's more like £40 billion.
Yes, but it's important to realise that the way in which the COVID borrowing will be repaid is from future EU budgets. But there's not yet a decision on whether that means a higher EU budget in future, therefore more call on member states, or cuts in their current receipts from the budget.
In other words, there might be higher budget payments to repay the COVID stimulus, or there might be funding cuts in other areas, so the EU budget payments don't go up at all. Overall, we think the number should be not £191 billion, but £40 billion. This is all sounding really like dodgy numbers on the side of a bus. Familiar? Well, yes. Perhaps it's worth reflecting on what we've learned since those heady Brexit referendum days, because for all the time, energy, and above all, attention focused during the referendum campaign on exactly how much the UK contributed to the EU budget, all the issues that have emerged since then make that seem too narrow a focus. For example, what would a future trade deal look like? What would the rules be for people coming to work or study in the UK, or Brits wanting to work or study on the continent? Surely we've learned that there was more to this decision than the size of the UK contribution to the EU budget. So please, let's not do this again. Our thanks to Professor Ian Begg from the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Before we go, don't forget about our Saturday programme. Last Saturday, Ben Goldacre. This Saturday, basketball.
So it turns out each inch roughly doubles your chances of becoming an NBA player throughout the height distribution. So if you're 6 feet tall, you have twice the chances of reaching the NBA as if you're 5'11". If you're 6'1", you have twice the chances of reaching the NBA as if you're 6 feet tall, all the way up to if you're 7 feet tall, you have twice the chance of becoming an NBA player compared to someone who's 6'11". And what that means is if you're below average height of an American male, below 5'10", you have a 1 in 3.8 million chance of reaching the NBA. If you're 7 foot or above, you have a 1 in 7 chance of reaching the NBA. Just an astronomical number.
Remember to search for More or Less Behind the Stats to find it on Sounds. And that is all we have time for this week. But the last episode in this series is next week, so you still have time to keep those questions and comments coming in. Our email address is moreorless@bbc.co.uk. Until next week, goodbye.
More or Less was presented by Tim Harford. The producer was Tom Coles. Now on Radio 4, it's just one thing, and Dr. Michael Mosley has a simple tip to get us all moving more, using something most of us already have in our pockets.
5,000 steps. We would all like some quick and simple ways to improve our health, but we're inundated with often conflicting advice. So, if you're going to try just one thing to improve your mental and physical well-being, what should it be? Maybe some green tea to boost your brain power, or doing a plank to lower your blood pressure. How about some small acts of kindness to benefit your immune system? I'm Dr. Michael Mosley, and this is Just One Thing, where each episode will explore one thing you can start doing today to improve your health or life in ways you might not expect. Now I have a long day of writing ahead of me, sitting at my computer, so before I start my day, I'm going to try using something that most of us have, and many of us, including me, never use. It's a really simple thing that might improve my blood sugars and blood fats, and who knows, might even keep my waistline trim. I'm using the fitness tracker on my phone. I'll just check it now. Yeah, it looks like I've only done about 600 steps today, so I should get moving. Oh, it's windy out here. Now, we all know that being active is incredibly good for our health, but despite our resolutions, few people manage to hit the recommended guidelines of exercise a week. But you don't have to buy a fancy fitness tracker. I'm actually just using an app that comes pre-installed on my phone. To be honest, I am quite skeptical that using a fitness tracker can encourage me to do just enough extra exercise to have an impact on my health. But I'll be speaking to a scientist behind a convincing new study later on. But first, let's see if tracking the movements is just one thing that Rumbi, a medical student based in Nottingham, would like to start doing. Hi Rumbi.
Hi Michael.
Now, as a medical student, do you spend a lot of your time at a desk studying?
Yes, a lot of time by a desk.
And are you an active person?
I try to be, but I'm not particularly active. I started fencing a few months ago, but I'm not that active at the moment.
Do you have an activity tracker at the moment?
I don't know.
What about on your phone? Because a lot of phones have them pre-installed.
Yeah, but I never really go onto my health app to check.
So I've got a challenge for you this week. On the first day, I'd like you to use your phone to track a normal day and find out how many steps you usually take.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want you to add 500 steps at first, building up to 2,000 steps extra a day over your baseline levels by the end of the week. Does that sound doable?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Really interested to see whether it helps your studies, whether it helps your sleep, whether you notice any difference.
Oh, that would be great. That would be an added bonus.
I've asked Rumbi to use the tracker on her smartphone over the next week, because increasing your activity really can make a big difference to your mental and physical health. Fitness trackers are big business, with sales beginning their rapid rise more than a decade ago. Today, 90% of UK adults own a smartphone, most of which have a pre-installed fitness app. And about a third of Brits also own a smart watch or fitness band. I have a fitness tracker that I once used obsessively, sometimes pacing the hallway outside my bedroom at night to meet my step goals. But when I lost the recharger, the tracker ended up in my bedroom drawer, where it has stayed ever since. But this episode might be the impetus I need to dust it off, because new research suggests they really can motivate you to move. More on that in a moment. Most of us have probably heard that you need to do at least 10,000 steps a day, which can be intimidating. But a recent study where they followed 220,000 people showed that doing just 4,000 steps a day is enough to start reducing your risk of dying prematurely from any cause. And the benefits were found in people of all ages. Some movement is good, but more is better. In fact, according to this study, every extra 1,000 steps you take beyond that initial 4,000 reduces your risk of dying early by an impressive 15%. But it's not just how far you move, it's also how fast you move. Smartphones are pretty good for counting steps, but if you want to measure intensity, you do need a proper fitness tracker. They produce graphs and numbers of active minutes you've done. So are they worth it? Well, there have been some interesting studies which showed that wearing a tracker can increase the amount of moderate to vigorous activity you do each day by about 6 minutes. Now that may not sound much, but it could make a big difference to my favourite organ, the brain. Another study, where researchers from University College London asked 4,000 middle-aged men and women to wear a tracker, found that those who did just 6 minutes more of moderate to vigorous activity a day had better brain performance. But how might wearing something on your wrist or opening an app on your phone make you more active? And are some trackers better than others? I'll be talking to an expert about that in a moment. But first, let's check in with Rumbi to find out how she's getting on.
So before starting the challenge, I kind of looked at the average number of steps I was doing per day, and it was just over 7,000. So the following day, I increased my step count by just over 500. I think I did feel slightly more energized than normal. Over the next few days, I increased my step count by just over 2,000 from my baseline. And on one particular day, I was feeling quite tired, so I decided to go on a walk, and I got back feeling in a good spirit, and I was able to get some work done that evening. So I thought it was really good.
We'll catch up with Rumbi again at the end of the week and see if tracking her activity is just one thing she'll keep up. Now let's speak to Professor Carol Marr from the University of South Australia, who's been studying activity trackers for 10 years. Hello, Professor Marr.
Hi, how are you doing?
Very good indeed, thank you. Can you tell me about your latest research?
So, we did what's called an umbrella review, the highest quality research that can be done. So we identified 39 systematic reviews, and they actually encompassed results from 163,000 participants who've been involved in studies of wearables. So we found that, without a doubt, studies where people use a wearable definitely lead to them doing more physical activity. In particular, on average, participants were taking vigorous physical activity per day. And on average, they were losing about 1 kilogram in body weight.
That is substantial, isn't it?
Yeah, quite substantial.
That's impressive. And in this umbrella study, people walked for 14 minutes more a day, around 1,800 steps. What effect would that have on their health?
It would have a substantial effect. Now, we know that even changing physical activity by about 5 to 10 minutes a day would have an excellent benefit for their physical health. And that includes their heart health, their metabolic health, which feeds into the risk of developing diabetes. It also would have a substantial benefit for mental health,
Right, so in this particular study, you found that people will walk you on average for about 40 minutes more a day, but they're actually only doing something which might be vigorous, for example, brisk walking. That was only 6 minutes, and that's really where you get the most benefit. So 6 minutes doesn't sound like a lot. Would that really have an impact?
Yeah, I think it does actually. Most governments around the world are encouraging adults to do at least 150 minutes of physical activity a week, but a small increase like 6 minutes offers substantial health benefits.
Now, there are also limitations, aren't there?
Yes, that's true. If you're doing something where there's not a lot of movement, then it won't be picking that up as exercise. However, because a lot of them have multiple sensors now, they are getting better at it. Quite a lot of the more modern wearables do give physical activity minutes, which is the non-lethal way of saying moderate to vigorous physical activity.
Brilliant. Have you looked at whether it is the tracker itself which is encouraging people to do more activity, or perhaps they had intended to do so anyway and they've just acquired a tracker and so it's a coincidence?
The bottom line is yes, the tracker makes a difference. We've done studies looking at this where we actually use a randomised controlled trial design. Before anything else happens, we actually take a baseline recording of their physical activity levels using research grade trackers. So research trackers don't have any feedback on them, so people wear them and we're recording their activity levels, but the participant gets no information about it. After they've had their baseline measures recorded, we randomly select half the participants to receive a wearable tracker that does have all of the feedback. They can do the goal setting and reminders to move and all that kind of thing. And so the only difference between the two groups is that one group got the trackers with feedback and the other group didn't. And so then we can be confident that it was the tracker that did it.
Why do you think that happens?
Wearables are pretty nifty tools. They help people understand how much activity they're actually doing. They help people goal set, they give feedback. They really do help people become the master of their own destiny when it comes to physical activity.
So most smartphones have some form of tracker in them. If you don't want to go out and get a tracker, what are the alternatives?
Look, I think anything that helps you track your activity levels and be more aware of what you're doing is helpful. So absolutely, the app on the phone is great. It measures steps. It allows you to track your progress over time. The only downside is that if you're not someone that carries your phone in your pocket all the time, you'll probably find that you're missing quite a lot of your steps.
So what would you recommend to someone who's got a busy lifestyle, who doesn't manage to fit in much exercise, who isn't using a tracker and is thinking about getting one?
Start by measuring how much activity you're doing. Either get a tracker or you could use your phone and just use it for a day or two to understand your baseline levels of activity. From there, I would recommend trying to add about 1,500 to 2,000 steps a day on top of your baseline levels. That's a really safe and achievable amount to aim for. And then a few weeks into it, you could start to actually try to make it a bit more vigorous.
It's good to know that randomised controlled trials really can show trackers can make people move more. So I've got mine out of the drawer and I'm powering it up. While it's recharging, let's check in one more time with Rumbi to see how her tracking challenge has gone.
Towards the end of the week, looking back, it's something that I've really enjoyed. It's been quite a straightforward, kind of attainable challenge, just increasing the number of steps I do by a small amount every day. It's made such a positive impact on me in terms of my mood, my energy levels, my ability to concentrate and to focus. On those days where I've not managed to maintain that target, I felt a lot more sluggish and tired than I did when I was able to meet that target. So I'm definitely going to be looking at ways that I can try and be a lot more consistent about this, because the impact it has is so worth it.
Now, it's great to hear that Rumbi has enjoyed her challenge. I've been wearing both my phone and my tracker so I can compare them, and the good thing is they seem to mesh. Now, both devices say I am short on steps today, It is cold and wet outside, but I've got an umbrella, so I'm going to head out in a bit and enjoy the benefits of a wet day. Find out more in our Embrace the Rain episode on BBC Sounds. That's it. It's just one thing you can do now, which really could benefit your body and life. If you want to hear more of the series, why not subscribe on BBC Sounds?
Next week, Michael considers how you can lift your mood and even trim that middle-aged spread just by switching up your snacks. Speaking of which, what impact does what we eat have on our memory? Should we be thinking about brain health when we make our food choices? And what does a lion's mane have to do with any of that? Claudia Hammond has more on All in the Mind this afternoon at 3:30.
We have a chance to build a digital Britain.
Yeah.
A better Britain.
A digital empire.
A digital empire. A Britain on which the digital sun never sets. So let's just remember that what we do today will shape the digital future of generations to come. The Ellis James and John Robbins podcast.
Even more groundbreaking features, scintillating chat and anecdotal gold that'll blow your socks off.
Listen twice a week on BBC Sounds.
Now on Radio 4, our book of the week, Chris Bryant's History of a Great Legal Injustice of the 19th Century, the story of the last men in Britain to be executed for sodomy.
James and John by Chris Bryant, read by Simon Russell Beale, Episode 3. It's 1835, and trapped by poverty and lack of privacy, James Pratt and John Smith have borrowed a rented room and risked everything. After James and John had disappeared up the stairs to William Bonnell's first floor room, something piqued John Berkshire's interest. During the 13 months that Bonnell had lodged there, the Berkshires had noticed that he frequently took men up to his room, generally in pairs and sometimes more than once a day. Full of suspicions, John Berkshire went out to the next door stable and squeezed himself into the loft. He dislodged a tile and could see Bonnell and John Smith sitting on either side of the window. After a few minutes he saw James Pratt sit on Bonnell's knee, and when Bonnell pushed him away, James sat on Smith's knee for several minutes. It was cramped in the loft, so John Berkshire soon gave up and went back indoors to his wife, to whom he related what he had seen. This prompted Jane Berkshire to go upstairs and peek through the keyhole of Bonnell's room. Bonnell had just left in search of a jug of ale, leaving James and John alone. Jane later claimed in court that she saw two men take down their trousers and start to have sex. She said that she saw the private parts of both men and that Smiths were in a state of connection. After less than a minute, scandalized, fascinated and furious, she ran downstairs to her husband and told him what she had seen. He immediately ran upstairs and also peered through the keyhole. This time, what he saw was far more incriminating than what he'd seen from the stables. Berkshire put his shoulder against the door and burst it open. The two men immediately drew apart, and terrified, they threw themselves on their knees and begged Berkshire to let them go, offering him their purses. At that moment, Bonnell returned with the jug of ale. "You old villain," cried Berkshire. "You've been practicing this in my place for some time past." "I know nothing of what's done in my place," Bonnell said. Who agreed to guard the three men while Berkshire set off in search of a police constable. Policing was a recent and controversial phenomenon. Sir Robert Peel had created the Metropolitan Police Force in 1829. However, his duties were clear. The constable had to arrest anyone he caught in the act of committing a felony. So Valentine went to 45 George Street and interrogated the three men. He examined Bonnell's room and the men's clothes and satisfied himself that the Berkshires' claims were well-founded. He marched the men through the streets of Southwark to Union Hall Police Office. This was where local justice was dispensed by 3 paid magistrates. It was not a large establishment, yet it had sole jurisdiction over the parishes south of the river. It was said you could spot the office by a number of sickly-looking women and pallid, gin-faced men lurking about the doors. Most Union Hall cases involved mediation over civil matters, but if there were enough prima facie evidence that a felony had been committed, which was by definition a capital offence, the magistrates who commit the suspect were trial by jury. The duty magistrate was the 32-year-old Hensley Wedgwood. He may not have been in a good mood that evening, as he lived 3 miles away in Clapham, which involved a hard ride down the Newington Road, and he generally found the evening sessions at Union Hall a waste of time. Yet Hensley was a compassionate and independently minded man. He'd spent his life in liberal Whig circles as the 4th son of Josiah Wedgwood, a keen abolitionist and electoral reformer, and grandson of the famous English potter. Hensley had proved himself a stickler for fairness. He'd been through a particularly grueling